Good evening. Sorry we're getting a little bit of a late start here. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the current executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. This is our 11th year, as some of you may know. We've handed out some 44 fellowships, and nearly 20 books have been published, and there are many more to come. This whole program is funded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation. And before I begin, I have a couple of announcements or boasts. Just a few weeks ago, the Alfred Sloan Foundation has awarded the Leon Levy Center a 3-year, $330,000 grant to allow us to fund a 5th fellowship at $72,000 a pop. This one devoted to biographers working on scientific figures or technical subjects. We're about to publicize this new science biography in things like the New York Review of Books, but I want you all to get the word out. If you have friends who are working on a book about a scientist, or tell them that there's an opportunity here to get funding. I should also mention that our current Leon Levy biography fellows, there are 4 of them. Rebecca Donner is working on a biography of Mildred Harnack. Stephen Heyman is doing Louis Bromfield. Jennifer Homans is doing George Balanchine. And Samantha Subramanian is doing a biography of the British scientist J.B.S. Haldane. Secondly, I'm very pleased that last month the CUNY Board of Trustees voted to approve a 2-year master's program in biography and memoir. This program still needs official approval from the New York State Department of Education, but we expect that to happen next month. And we're beginning to plan a recruitment campaign to recruit 10 to 15 students in biography for the autumn of 2019 semester, so less than a year away. This will be the first ever graduate program in biography, a degree program where students will actually study the art and craft of biography and learn how to do it over 2 years and get a master's degree in it. It's unheard of. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the country. I think there may be one similar program in England, but otherwise it's singular to the globe. They also will be studying not only biography but memoir. And I think a lot of our potential students may be people here in New York City who have led interesting lives and now want to write a memoir but don't know how to do it. Anyway, bear that too in mind. Anyway, we are here this evening for a very special event with my celebrated predecessor. Gary Giddins was the executive director of the Biography Center for 5 years, from 2011 to 2016. And he really put it on the map, elevating its public programs to new intellectual heights. He's a consummate interviewer and a scholar and a gentleman. Nearly 30 years ago, critic Martin Williams called Gary Giddins, quote, probably the most impressive journalist ever to have written about music. Born in Brooklyn, Giddins graduated from Grinnell College in Iowa. In 1973, he joined the Village Voice, and a year later, he introduced his column, Weatherbird, which he ended in 2003, closing a 30-year run. He is the author of a dozen books, including biographies of Louis Armstrong and Charlie Parker, and he's won numerous awards, including the National Book Critics Circle Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Peabody in Broadcasting. Now, the very last sentence of Robert Gottlieb's 2001 review of Gary Giddins' Volume 1 on Bing Crosby reads, "Now, where is Volume 2? Well, we all know that good biography takes years to gestate, but we are here tonight to celebrate the arrival of Volume 2. Now, I was going to say that Gary was being joined on stage this evening by Harry Crosby, the fifth son of Bing and Catherine Crosby. But he's taken an absence suddenly. But he's also known as being on the board of numerous philanthropic institutions, including jazz. And, you know, in the jazz world, you sometimes have to improvise. So tonight we're going to improvise a little bit. Instead of having a conversation between the son and the son of the subject and the biographer, I'm going to sit down with Gary, and we're being joined by Geoffrey Ward, who last September gave us the Leon Levy lecture on biography. Jeff is an award-winning biographer in his own right, known for his work on Franklin Roosevelt and Mark Twain and many other works, and also his fabulous work as a scriptwriter for almost all of Ken Burns's famous documentaries. And Jeff is also, well, Jeff is a polymath. He knows a lot about many subjects, including music and jazz, and I'm assuming a little bit about Bing. So on that note, we'll begin and have a conversation for 30 or 40 minutes, and then there'll be a book, there'll be an opportunity for some questions, I hope. And there'll be a book signing at the end, and we're going to have a terrific time. So, Gary, I guess I want to ask, why did it take so long?
It actually surprises me that everybody is obsessed with this question, and that reviewers think they have. I have a mic. Okay. I hope it's working. Yeah. Think that it's their business. I really don't. Biography has its own timeline. The other day, a couple of weeks ago, actually, a few weeks ago, Robert Caro was speaking here and spoke of having to move his family to the hill country in Texas for 3 years just to get a bunch of ranchers there to talk to him. If I had finished this book, this book was finished January 5th of 2017, and was hoping for the end of the year, but Little Brown decided that they wanted to. They did a gorgeous job on this book, and that took extra time. But if I had finished the book, say at the beginning of 2016, I wouldn't have had the extraordinary journal that Crosby kept that nobody had ever seen. It took that long for me to.
When did that come out? When did you discover that?
Well, it's really quite a story. When I had been at the Crosby house, I took a whole bunch of papers and photocopied them, and I took some things that couldn't be photocopied. And one thing was a tiny address book. At least that's what I thought it was. And Catherine said, well, just take it. And I was writing the early parts of the book, and really didn't think about it. And I had a wonderful assistant for almost 14 years named Elora Charles. And Elora was going through the files, and right at the point that I got up to like 43 or 44, she said, what about this? And I looked at it, and I said, it was tiny little writing in it. And I said, well, it's not where I am now, so let's just put it in 45 and we'll get to it. So Crosby went to England and France in 44. And I had a terrible time with that section. It was the one section in the book that I was really unhappy with. I had been able to find a few French newspaper accounts that I had translated. My wife and I had gone to Normandy. We had spent some time in Paris where Crosby was, but I just didn't have. There was so little material. There was just no documentation.
Biographers always complain that there's not enough material.
Well, there wasn't anything, and I found that, and I did one chapter on both of them, and I was just not happy with it. And then after Elora passed, I couldn't even go into the room in my office where she worked for several months. It was completely sudden. And then I'd written that section, and I went to get all the materials on 45, and I see the notebook, this address book. And I open it up, and it's the first couple of pages are just phone numbers and people. And I had taken it from Catherine because I thought it might give me some names that I would not otherwise have even looked into that might have some resonance in the story. And then I sort of focused my eyes and realized, to my absolute astonishment, I mean, this could almost make a religious believer of me, that this was the only journal Crosby ever kept in his life, and it was about London and France. It was about the stuff that the period that I didn't have material on. Well, it took me about, I don't know, a month or two. Debbie probably has a clearer idea. It took me a very long time just to transcribe it, to read through it. And then I had all the pages enlarged. So that it was, because there were several words that we just couldn't figure out. I knew his handwriting pretty well, but eventually we figured out every word, and we had a complete transcription. And not only was it an amazing document in that it gave me, when he didn't know where he was, which he frequently didn't, because this was Jeep traveling right near the front, right not far from the German line, started coming in through Cherbourg, where he landed with Fred Astaire, and then they started to move east. And as they got towards where the Metz campaign was, this is where the Germans were still trying, Patton was still trying to win Metz so that then they could make the eastern shove right into over the Rhine. And so Crosby would go out in the morning with his troop in a Jeep, and sometimes they knew where they were, and sometimes they would stop when they found a group of men, and there was nothing really that planned. But Crosby was incredible because even when he didn't know where he was, he would give coordinates. And with Google Maps and his coordinates, I could pretty much figure out where he was. And Google Maps, I just have to say, my office looked like, remember the movie Blow Up? I had all of France in like 8x10 Google Map enlargements, taped up over walls, trying to estimate the mileage and how they got from, and a lot of the stuff that had previously been written that was in my chapter was just wrong. It was places he never got even close to. I don't even know how they got into the story. So I went into Little Brown to my editor with this thing, and I said, "You're not going to believe this, but that's why you have to see it with your own eyes." And he actually sort of trembled a little bit when he looked at it because it was an astonishing thing. And I said, "I'm going to have to tear up that." I'd been giving him chapters as I finished. I said, "That chapter I'm tearing up." And he said, "Well, you're not tearing it up. You're just going to revise it." And I said, "No, it's over. It's done. It's torn up. It's..." And so anyway, this is one of the passages in the book that I'm most proud of. The American reviewers so far haven't had much to say about it, but those in France and England have been knocked out about it. One British writer said it was breathtaking. And for me, certainly, it just really clinched the story of just how courageous Crosby was during the war. And as I say, I didn't realize it until 2016. He was within 1,000 yards, and on occasion, the men, on one famous occasion, they were called to go to their divisions immediately because the Germans were coming over the hill. And in the book, I reproduce a letter that came 65 years later from an 85-year-old veteran who still can't believe it. It was like an hallucination to him that Bing Crosby would be that close to the lines. Bombs were frequently, helicopters, all kinds of, war material was visible and audible at some of the places he performed at. And the thing about Crosby is he was truly modest to a fault. He never spoke about any of this. He talked about it briefly. He gave a number of press conferences when he came back because he felt the obligation to bear witness. But he wrote a memoir called Call Me Lucky in 1953. There's not one sentence about his war work. There's half a sentence about the Victory Caravan from '42, and that's only because it's a joke that he's the butt of, but nothing. And he felt it was wrong to publicize it. He felt there wasn't something he wanted to boast about. You know, Bob Hope made it the rest of his life, so everybody associates him with USO, but nobody did, including Hope, more than Crosby did during the Second World War.
So this causes me to wonder, as you learned more and more about Bing, what was there a gap? There's always a gap, but how much of a gap was there between the public persona and the private man?
That's a really interesting question because, you know, there's a line in an Edward Albee play that sometimes you have to go a long way out of your way to come back a short distance correctly. After some 10 years after Crosby died, there was a hatchet job and there was Gary Crosby's book, and everybody said, well, he was a different person. After, how long has it been now? 25 years of research, I've come to find that Crosby was pretty much the character that everybody in the 1940s and 50s thought he was. He was not, you know, a great parent to his first 4 children. He was to the next 3, but and he was an absentee father, and his
And he had a difficult marriage.
It was a very difficult marriage, but generally speaking, he was a decent man. He was a charming man. He was. Here's one thing that nobody knew, because the whole persona. Artie Shaw once said to me that Bing Crosby was no more Bing Crosby than Humphrey Bogart was Humphrey Bogart, meaning that the Crosby persona is something he created, and part of that persona is that he's lazy. You know, he doesn't want to work. He's Huckleberry Finn. He's just, everything is so cool. You know, Tony Bennett, after Bing died, said, you know, Bing invented suburbia. I said, what? he said, man, he taught everybody to relax. In truth, he was a workaholic. He was the hardest working man in Hollywood. He was making 3 movies a year. He was also doing an hour weekly broadcast on the radio. He was making between 30 and 60 recordings every year. And during the war years, he made hundreds of recordings that were never heard in this country for the Armed Forces radio services. And he was on tour almost constantly. When he wasn't actually filming, he was on tour in this country and then after D-Day in Europe.
Can I just ask one? It is true what Martin Williams said. Gary is an unbelievably smart person about American culture just in general. He wrote the best thing about Louis Armstrong ever written. A lot of other people have written books. His is this long, and you got to start there. So I am very interested in the relationship between Bing Crosby and Louis Armstrong. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that came as a surprise to me, and you know, this was not my idea originally. Crosby was not my idea. I had just done the Armstrong book, and the editor of that was a man named Paul Bresnik at Doubleday, and he said, would I be interested in writing a biography of Crosby? And I thought, no, I'm not. I loved Crosby's early recordings with Whiteman. His singing on those records, his approach to time is unlike anything. They're really quite wonderful, but I wasn't interested in the Christmas stuff and the later material, and I hadn't seen most of his movies, and except for the road movies, the few that I'd seen hadn't made much of an impression. So I kept turning him down for about 2 years, and eventually I started to realize that what he had done for the technology, and then I started looking at some of the movies going my way after I saw it in a sold-out Lincoln Center theater. It was the first time I realized what a genuinely great film it is. I started listening more to the recordings, and then I said, okay, I'll do it, and I signed a contract to write 1 volume, 300 pages in 3 years. Didn't work out that way. But one of the things that I had in mind was in 1970, 6, Crosby came to New York to do a show at the Uris Theater with his family, Rosemary Clooney, a fantastic quartet with Joe Bushkin, Johnny Smith, Milt Hinton, and Jake Hanna. I mean, just really superb. And the highlight of it was at the second half, Crosby and the quartet would do a medley of like, I don't know, 45 Crosby top 10 hits. Just, 16 bars, and then it was amazing. It was a real act of virtuosity. Well, because I was doing this piece for The Voice, for some reason I got into the rehearsal, and there was nobody else in the theater in the rehearsal except the Voice photographer and myself. And as the rehearsal finished, his representative came over to me and said, "I can give you 2 minutes alone with Mr. Crosby before the press comes in." So I said, great. I didn't know what I was going to say. But everybody was talking at that time about the fact that both of them had just done programs. They did each a program solo with David Frost, and then they did one, the two of them, with David Frost. And on the one Armstrong did, he talked about how long he's known Crosby and that they go friends, back to the 20s, but that in all those years, he had never invited me out to the house. So, being a Village Voice writer, I walked over to him and I said, he shook hands, and I said, I have to ask you, did you hear about what Louis Armstrong said about, not being invited to your house? And he said, well, Pops and Lucille never had me to their house. I thought that was the coolest, wittiest possible response there could be. And the fact that he said Pops, that sort of lets you know right away. And then when I started researching, I found these letters that went back. Armstrong adored Crosby. Well, just to go back to the house, I have to say, I told this story to Rosemary Clooney, who became a very good friend and enabled me to do a lot of things I wouldn't have been able to do in this book. And Rosemary said the thing Pops didn't understand was that nobody was invited to the Crosby house. That's where he went to get away from.
I mean, he just never socialized at home?
He socialized in the earlier years, but after the house burned down, the mansion burned down in the first days of 1943, a Christmas tree, the lighting, the light bulbs, there was a short, the tree was old already, and it just turned into a torch and destroyed the house. And they moved into a much larger house in Holmby Hills. And at that point, the marriage was really in bad shape, and he was away all the time. And when he came home, he just wanted to disappear into his study or be with his family, trying to make up time that he had lost. So let me just go back a little bit to Jeff's question, because it's really fascinating to me. One of the first things I did was I put the Crosby discographies and the Armstrong discographies together. And it is amazing how often Louis covered tunes that Bing had just recorded. And it occurred to me that it was partly this friendship between them that encouraged Armstrong to start doing Tin Pan Alley. Instead of just, St. James Infirmary and original type jazz pieces, he would do Just a Gigolo. They were always the pieces that Bing had, Wrap Your Troubles in Dreams, which was written for Crosby. They met in 1926. When he was still in California, Crosby, and completely unknown, working the second line vaudeville tours in California with a pianist, Mildred Bailey had told him that she heard about this guy. I mean, he hadn't recorded under his own name. She said, he had just been signed with Whiteman's band, and she said, you gotta search this guy out. His name is Louis Armstrong. He's from New Orleans. And so when they got to Chicago, Whiteman and a few of the people in the band that he actually liked were going to the Sunset Cafe to see Louis Armstrong, and he invited Bing, and he said, oh yeah, I want to do that. And years and years later, Joe Bushkin told me they were sitting backstage at one of these tours, and Bing got very meditative, and he started talking about the first time he saw him. And then he said, Louis Armstrong is the greatest popular singer that ever lived or ever will live. And Bushkin said, well, we all love Pops, but are you thinking of something specific? And he said, when he sings a sad song, you cry. When he sings a happy song, you laugh. What the hell else is there in popular music?
Yeah.
And so, you know, Crosby was, you know, he insisted when he got to produce his first film in 1936, Pennies from Heaven, he insisted that Armstrong be billed. That, first of all, he insisted that Armstrong be in the movie. And the producer was like, why? You know, isn't there some black guy in Los Angeles? If you have to have some jazz person that we can find, do we have to really fly? And one of the things I really came to admire about Crosby is that he didn't negotiate. If he knew he was right, he would just say, I'm going to play golf, call me when you change your mind. and everybody knew that about him, so they had to sign Louis Armstrong. And then Crosby said, and he's going to be billed with me above the title. No black performer had been billed in a white film before. He's only in the movie for 7 minutes. And then after that, Armstrong started getting a lot of calls to do the kinds of, you know, guest pieces that in the South they could cut out of the movie. And he brought him on radio. When he started the Philco show, he was a regular. He was on all the time. When there was a problem in the late 1930s where Armstrong did a scene that wasn't very good. It was a piece of music that he should never have agreed to perform. It was beneath him. And eventually the producer said, this isn't working, so they cut it out. There was a big controversy about why is Armstrong not going to be in this film. And Crosby said, we're going to have him in a film soon, and when he's in it, it won't be just, you know, a feature. He'll be a part of the film. And it'll be worthy of him. And it took 20 years, but that movie was High Society, and that was a very important film in Armstrong's career. And then even, you know, he became regular on television. Whenever Bing did a TV show, Pops was frequently on it. In 1956, the first important show that Bing ever did on television was called The Edsel Show, to promote that beloved car that Ford put out, named after his son Edsel. And Armstrong had just attacked Eisenhower for not going to Little Rock. It was front page news. A lot of performers completely freaked out. He was attacked in editorials all over the country. Jim Bishop, the guy who wrote the day Jesus died, the day Lincoln died, he was the what's his name? The guy who was fired from Fox. The guy who writes, the guy who was fired from Fox, he was
Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah, he was sort of the O'Reilly of that period.
Right.
And he wrote a column that was syndicated that said, you know, I ask you, Louis Armstrong, what have you ever done for your people? You know, it was just bizarre. So Ford called CBS, which was doing the show, and said, look, this is about promoting a car. The last thing we need is controversy. We can't have Louis Armstrong on this. Tell Bing we'll do another show later. And CBS, the head of CBS, called Crosby and told him this. And Bing said, well, if you don't want Louis on the show, that's your business, but I won't be there either.
Oh.
And so not only did Armstrong appear on the show, but the show opens with Crosby and Armstrong doing Now You Has Jazz. And one of the most moving clips you'll ever see, if you can find it, I think it's still on YouTube, is the last appearance they did together on the Hollywood Palace, where they do a medley, and Bing just puts his arm around him, and they just look at each other, and it's a very moving thing. And then they just walk off, and the camera just holds them until they disappear into the dark. It's a marvelous thing. And then after Armstrong died, they turned the area that had once been Congo Square in the 1840s into Louis Armstrong Park, and they were building a statue, and they ran out of money. And somebody said, you know, Bing Crosby was close to him, and Crosby sent them a blank check, literally a blank check, to finish it. So it was a very interesting relationship. And musically, it was a profound one, because the thing that distinguished Bing from all the other singers of that period, white singers anyway, is that he had incredible time. And when Artie Shaw said, The first thing you have to understand about Bing Crosby is he was the first hip white person born in the United States. What he meant was he understood Armstrong, he understood time. And I remember when I first started the book, I was talking to Jimmy Heath one night at the Vanguard, and he said, "What are you up to?" And I said, "I think I'm going to write a book about Bing Crosby." And he said, "Oh man, Bing Crosby, I want to read that." I said, "Really, were you a fan?" And he said, "Well, where do you think we got the songs? He was the only guy in the air who had time."
Wow.
So,
Can I ask another musical one?
please.
People I know tend to either like Frank Sinatra or Bing Crosby. Why is that? And how do you weigh them?
I don't know. It wasn't really like that at first. You know, they manufactured this fake feud between Bing and Frank. I talk about this quite in the book, that there were a lot of fake feuds preceding the Second World War and then during it. Bing and Bob, you know, that for 35 years they would tell jokes at each other's expense, and there was the Walter Winchell, Ben Burney feud, and the Jack Benny, Fred Allen feud, and they were all, you know, just show business stuff. But the Crosby Sinatra one really got sort of serious, because not between them, but there were high schools, you know, voting, and it was like, you know, we won't sit with that person, he's a Sinatra person, or, you know, I mean, it just was really
Still
nuts.
like that, kind of.
Still like that. Well, it's worse now. You know, people forget now that so much was made of Sinatra. He was such a phenomenon that they think that he outshone him, but it's just not even remotely true. I mean, at one point they said, why don't we switch the night of your show, the Kraft Musical, to Tuesday, we'll put you up against Sinatra. And Bing said, we can't do that to him, it'll kill his career, and it would have. I mean, he wasn't saying it in a boastful way, he was saying it in a, you know, why would you want to do that to him? He's just getting started. The fact is that, you know, if you listen to and I love the records Frank made in the 40s, but they're all ballads. You know how many up-tempo tunes he did between 1942 and 1948? 3. And then his career completely tanked in 48, and for 5 years, he really couldn't get arrested. I mean, he was doing cutlery commercials on television with a mustache, standing at a table and saying, ladies, if you need a really sharp knife, I mean, this was Frank Sinatra. And then he remade himself. It's one of the great reinventions in the history of American popular culture. He got together with a great orchestrator, Nelson Riddle, and then another one, Billy May, and he invented his own way of swinging. It wasn't a jazz swing. A lot of people were insulting about it. They called it a businessman's bounce, which I think is unfair, because when Sinatra's at his best, he's quite magnificent. And you know, Crosby had nothing but respect for him as an artist. But you know, I quote Dinah Shore at some length in the book, comparing the two. And she talks about, you know, Bing had perfect pitch, he had time. She said the thing you loved about him was that he was so spontaneous. When he talked, when he read lines, you felt like they had just occurred to him. And when he sings, he could do the same thing. She said there were only 2 people in the business who sang the way they talked, Bing and Nat Cole. She said that is the hardest thing to do, and I can't think of anybody else who was ever able to do it. But she said, I don't know if Bing ever made me weep the way Frank made me weep. She said, Frank would cut a vein. He would really let you see inside him. And as I say in the book, Crosby did not invite his audience to inspect his insecurities. This is what made him such a powerful presence for the troops. Frank was singing ballads, love songs to women. Bing understood immediately that you don't go into a group of men living in mud who have not seen a woman, who are missing home, and sing love songs to them, reminding them of what they're missing. So he devised this repertory, especially for the troops. And he sort of, had a tremendous influence on redefining what masculinity was in that period. And for example, I mean, he refused to ever appear as a film star when he toured. He would not wear his toupee. He would never wear it publicly. I interviewed his toupee maker, whose 3 whose three most prominent clients.
That's research, Gary.
In his office, he had three busts, one for Bing, one for John Wayne, and one for Humphrey Bogart. and these were the three, the three standard toupees that he had made for each of them. And he said, John Wayne would have rather have been shot than ever be seen bald. And he was really bald. And he said that Bing, he just didn't give a shit. And, he just had a stoicism about him, an aloofness, which came to seem very dated when Sinatra was, moving everything into a jet set kind of tempo and a much more personal kind of interpretation. But I think that, I'd like to think that Crosby's time will come back because, first of all, there's nobody else like him. You may think that, he's just one of a lot of singers in that period, but he's not. He was able to do songs that nobody else could do, including Sinatra, especially Sinatra. He was able to do 19th century songs from, from minstrelsy, from vaudeville, from the abolitionist movement, songs that he could make seem very real. One of the songs that two that I analyze a bit in the book. One is, let me mention three. One is Beautiful Dreamer, which he sings exactly as Stephen Forster wrote it, and it's something of a revelation to hear. And, I think it was Otis Ferguson said that if Forster could ever hear anybody sing the song, he'd want to hear Crosby sing it because he makes you think this is the way it must have sounded. It meant something to people when the song was originally composed. Then he found a song, I don't know who found it, whether it was Crosby or Jack Cap. It was probably Cap, but it was a song called Sierra Sue. It's the only song ever written by somebody named Joseph Buell Carey. It was never published and it was never recorded. It had been sitting around in some music publisher's office for a quarter of a century. And Crosby turned it into a #1 hit. In fact, at that time, it was a record of real importance to him. It's a song that captured not the depression, but some of the despair of that period. What Jack Cap understood and what Crosby could realize in his music was that despite the swing era, despite the thump, thump, thump of the jazz bands and the boogie woogie and all of that, which was so important to the American audience, there was also a yearning for something that was down deep, historical, something that bound us together. And Crosby was the only one who could convey that in song. The third recording that I go into a bit is an impossible thing. It was a really sentimental, egregiously sentimental fraternity song written at the turn of the century called The Girl of Sigma Chi. And Crosby turns it into a de facto art song. It's magical. And it's one of the records where his rehearsal take still exists, which I found fascinating, because the rehearsal he does only with his guitarist and the pianist. And he sings it fast as could be. I mean, no emotion, no feeling, nothing. He's just checking the intervals to make sure he's got all the intervals, because he doesn't read music. And then he turns to the conductor, John Trotter, and he says he's ready. And now the whole orchestra, this big orchestra, comes in, and it's very slow, and it's majestic and dramatic, and it's just, when you listen to it, you think, could any other singer have gotten away with this, had pulled this off? I don't think so. But the one artist who did love this song, I didn't learn this until years later, maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, it was John Coltrane. Coltrane loved the chords, and he must have had some attachment. Maybe he heard Crosby's record when he was a kid.
Probably.
But he used it as a rehearsal piece. He played it a lot.
So Gary, this volume is about the war years, and the way you were talking about Louis Armstrong and their relationship, during the war years, there's a lot of politics going on. What were Crosby's politics and how did they evolve?
He campaigned briefly for Wendell Willkie
In 40.
in 1940 when he ran against Roosevelt. A lot of people on the left supported Willkie because they liked Roosevelt, but they were afraid of the third term, especially in a period when dictatorships are rising all over the place. And Willkie was the most liberal Republican probably since Theodore Roosevelt. Ever. I mean, he ran a campaign, a serious campaign, without attacking Roosevelt, without attacking Lend-Lease, without trying to lie about Roosevelt being a warmonger and all of that. I mean, there's a wonderful new book about Wendell Willkie by David Levering Lewis. It just came out like a month ago. I highly recommend it. Anyway, after that, he said he's never going to be seen with a politician again. He just didn't feel it was right for a film star to use his popularity to promote it. And in fact, he had some real difficulty, when you visited Bob Hope's office, a picture of him playing golf with Spiro Agnew and Gerald Ford and every politician of the last 50 years. The only photograph that Crosby ever allowed with a politician was with his old friend Shirley Temple Black, who didn't get elected. But when I went to the Crosby home a few weeks, I was in San Francisco, and Catherine Crosby came to the book signing and invited me to the house, and we did a long, leisurely walk through this magnificent mansion in Hillsborough. And there was a little private place in his study, and sure enough, there's half a dozen pictures of Bing with politicians. Oh. But not one of them was ever shown publicly or published. He would not allow that.
Were they all Republican?
Oh, not at all. He supported JFK, he hated Nixon. I mean, his politics were, he was a conservative Republican. He was against the war in Vietnam, came out in the Wall Street Journal. No, I think actually it was in the Daily News that he gave an interview, which he said. He was in favor of the legalization of marijuana. He was completely ahead of the curve on civil rights and any kind of issue like that. Anthony Quinn said to me once, Bing Crosby was the first person I ever met in Hollywood who didn't talk to me like I was a Mex. I heard gay people telling me that he was completely, just live and let live. He just never felt a breeze from him. I interviewed a woman who later went on to become quite successful in television. She produced a show called The Rockford Files. Some of you remember that, James Garner. And but she was on the left in the late 40s. Her husband was George Rosenberg, who was Bing's agent. But Mito Rosenberg was called before HUAC, and she named names to her everlasting regret. And she was very candid about it. And I said, I never understood why they didn't call Crosby. They called his friends Gary Cooper, they called Leo McCarey, they called Disney, Crosby knew. And she said, are you kidding? If they had called Crosby, he would have told them to fuck off. Now what are they going to do? Say Bing Crosby's a communist? and I said, but are you confident that he would really have said fuck off to HUAC? And she said, if you don't understand that about Bing, you don't understand anything about Bing. And it's very interesting when you read the HUAC transcripts, because a lot of the people on the right, Republican conservatives in Crosby circle, they testified, but they didn't name names. They had no names to mention. Gary Cooper was never in a communist cell. Who was he going to name? And yet the really bad sons of bitches, they did. Robert Taylor. He didn't like somebody on a set, he named the names. Yeah. He would say, he said famously, Howard Da Silva always has something to say about everything. That was the end of Howard Da Silva's career. Ayn Rand, she didn't know a bloody thing. She just named everybody that she didn't like, whoever did her wrong. There were ways that you could testify and keep some of your self-respect, But Crosby, she said Crosby would never have bowed his head to those people.
So talk a little bit about Bob Hope and their relationship.
They first worked together in 1933 in New York. Bing was headlining at the Capitol Theater, and Hope was on the bill. And they hit it off at a lunch place one day, and they just found that their sense of humor was, and so they went back on the stage that day, and they started improvising shtick. And they did it for the entire engagement. And that was it. They never saw each other again for 6 years. Wow. And then Bing, meanwhile, the next year went to Hollywood, and he made the big broadcast. Well, he had made the big broadcast, but now he was actually signed to a contract at Paramount. Became a huge film star. Hope, in the middle 30s, suddenly became a Broadway star. He was in the original production of Roberta, and which was a Cole Porter musical. And on the basis of that, he became quite well known in New York. And finally, when he was, in his 30s, 36, Paramount offered him, he became popular on the radio as well. They invited him out to Hollywood. And Hope, they treated him like, they treated all like a hillbilly who just wandered in off the road. And he was ready to pack up the first night and get out of there. But Crosby said, don't make any fast decisions. Why don't you come down to Del Mar, the racetrack that Crosby had helped to start. And we're having what did he call it? The clam bake. We're having the clam bake party. And so he called him up on stage, and they did the same routines they used to do at the Capitol Theater. The head of Paramount, who was there, thought they were making it all up. They thought, this is genius. I've never seen such chemistry between two people that don't even know each other. So they didn't disabuse them. And they signed Bob, and he made a couple of movies, one of which was pretty well. And then they did Road to Singapore, which became the top grossing movie of 1940. Well, during the war, Crosby probably spent more time with Hope than he did with his wife. I mean, they were on the road every day playing golf and raising money, but they never socialized beyond that. Crosby really believed that you save it for the screen. Mm-hmm. He said many times, if Bob and I had, gone out and had a drink or had dinner together, we would have used up everything. And then we would have been like, oh, that was a great line, and then you try to repeat it. When I first heard about this, I remembered there was a movie, I'm sure most of you know it, called Groundhog Day. And there's a scene where Bill Murray is romancing the woman, I forgot the actress, Andie MacDowell, and it's going really, really well, and then, he wakes up. But he remembers what he did. But this time when he does it, it's completely phony because he's just recreating, and she sees through him in a minute. And I think that's exactly what Crosby was trying to get at. He also, he was offended by Hope's philandering, which he didn't take any, didn't disguise. He felt the same way about Sinatra. He thought, whatever you do in private is one thing, but to humiliate your wife, let everybody know that you've got mistresses planted all over the country, he didn't think that was a good thing. So they didn't really become, as Hope's wife said to me, Bing's life was, when he wasn't playing golf, was fishing and hunting, and the only thing Bob would ever have hunted was a golf ball. So he said, they really didn't have much in common that way. Outside of the golf and the movies. But then something odd happened. In 1961, they went to London with their families to make a movie called Road to Hong Kong. And they were offered a castle to live in and the two of them to share. And Dolores said that's when they discovered they loved each other because they were spending every day together. And suddenly it became very, very personal.
So you referred earlier to how hardworking Bing was. And I see in the book that I think this is early in the war, he has a tax bill of like $130,000, and his accountant tells him he's really,
In trouble.
in trouble. He's
Yeah.
got to work harder. He should take out some life insurance to make sure that if he drops dead, his debts are paid. He's I guess on a treadmill. He's really he has high expenses, right?
Yeah, the book begins with what I call a prelude. It's 4 or 5 letters that takes him from 1927, when he's completely broke and doesn't even know if he's going to stay in show business, to 1937, where he writes out a list of how many employees he has, like 15 employees that are, hundreds of dollars each in salaries, and he's got stables and trainers and 5 people living in the house, servants, but for all that, he's spending a lot of money on breed. Horse racing was a very serious thing for him. And he was losing money wagering and in building up a stable, 2 actually, one in the United States and another in Argentina. And he really didn't make a lot. He was earning tons of money, but his business sense wasn't really in its stride yet. And then after the war, he hired somebody named Basil Grillo, who really took over his finances and made it all work. For example, Bing started Bing Crosby Productions and produced 2 really bad movies, interesting movies, but just bad movies, and they didn't make any money, and so he ended Bing Crosby Productions. Basil Grillo started it up again, and they went into television, and Bing Crosby Productions produced Ben Casey, Hogan's Heroes. I mean, they had a whole, everything they did was a hit, except for the Bing Crosby show, the 30-minute show that Bing started. That didn't work at all. One of the things I learned about him in this book that I really did not know and was not expecting ever to find, and it's only because of the papers that I was able to go through in the Crosby home. The one thing I never imagined Crosby being was despairing and irresolute about his future. He's just always, to me, the very soul of confidence, whatever else he is. He just doesn't care. He can walk away from it. That's part of the persona, but I think it's also part of him. And in 1941, he wanted to stop everything. He asked his wife for a divorce. He rescinded that, but nevertheless, they went to Reno to get a residency. He wanted desperately to get out of the radio contract. He refused to make any more independent films, which he had fought for years to get the right to do that. He was complaining that he was tired of his own voice. He didn't think his singing was any good. He thought he was stale. He made a private, this is one of the lucky things that a biographer happens to, and you just think, how lucky, how could this be? He made an appointment with a man named Tom McInerney, who was the head of Kraft Foods. This was the guy who started out, he founded the Hydrox Company and Breakstone Cheese, and then Kraft became he was the biggest dairy figure in the United States. And he was the guy who paid the salaries to everybody who ran Kraft Music Hall and the J. Walter Thompson advertising agency. And Bing was giving them all a hard time, and then he just said, the hell with it, I'm gonna go to the top. I'm gonna go to the guy who pays their salaries. So he made an appointment with McInerney. And the thing that I can't believe as a biographer is that when he left, McInerney called in somebody and wrote up every single thing that Crosby said that they could remember. Oh. And then sent it to John Reber, the head of J. Walter Thompson and the Kraft show. And J. Walter Thompson then dictated all those notes in a letter to 4 or 5 people who were in the Kraft, one of which letters came to me. And there is Crosby sitting there with him. And at one point, McInerney says, do you want more money? And Crosby says, no, what would be the use? That's not what we're talking about. And he was quite serious. Wow. I mean, he could have asked, he was getting paid less than a lot of major radio stars, and yet he was much bigger than those other radio stars. And every sponsor in the country was trying to get him out of craft, offering all kinds of, he just liked people to be loyal and dependable. He did not want more money, but he was really at a crossroads, and he didn't know what to do about it. And then Pearl Harbor comes, and Pearl Harbor saves him. I'm absolutely convinced this is one of the reasons he felt so much devotion to the troops, because it gave him a mission, it gave him his life back. Suddenly, he was more in demand than ever, and he found something in himself that it was bigger than himself that he thought was important. Singing to these men made differences in their lives. He got, Henry Morgenthau wrote him several letters saying, it's hard to overstate your importance to the home front. This book is really, in large part, about the home front. I mean, I read dozens and dozens of books about the Second World War, and you could read hundreds of books about the Second World War and never see Crosby or any other entertainer in the index, and hardly anything about the home. I found one really good book that had been written about the home front, and that was in the 70s. But it was all, how much bread cost and that kind of thing. But the home front, Alistair, McLeish, the poet, what's his name?
Archibald
McLeish. When he became the head of the Office of War Information, he said that the primary field of war is not Europe, it's not South America, it's South Pacific. It's the mind of the American public. And Eisenhower said the same thing. He said the mind of the American public is our main strategy. Because if they don't support what we're doing, we're not going to have an army. We're not going to be able to raise the money. We all lived through that with Vietnam. And creating a home front was a major, major issue, and nobody did more to hold people together than Crosby. I ask people all the time, can you think of anybody else beyond Crosby whose art in its peak in the 1940s crossed every single boundary? There's no gender, there's no age. High school kids loved him, their parents loved him, their grandparents loved him. There's no ethnicity. He was the first white performer to be routinely included on jukeboxes in Harlem. I remember Lena Horne telling me that when she went back to Harlem after a few years at MGM, she said, black people love Bing Crosby. She said, they like Billy Eckstine too, but they love Bing Crosby. And, he just struck a nerve at that time, I give him a hard time in the book over his recording of I'll Be Seeing You, which is one of the great songs to come out of the Second World War. And Bing's was the only one that was a #1 hit. But I think it's not a particularly great performance. And I think he probably thought so too, because he then sang it on the Kraft Music Hall a few weeks later, a performance that exists in which he's magnificent. But I think he recorded it too soon, and he didn't really know the tune that well. But it didn't matter to anybody. They weren't looking for the breathing and whether the mordants worked and,
Yeah.
So Gary, I get the sense you are really glad you did this.
You'd have to ask
Despite
my wife.
your reluctance initially. So we've gone on for, believe it or not, more than an hour now. And maybe we should, Jeff, do you have any other?
No, that's fine.
Maybe we should garner some questions from the audience. There are microphones on either side.
When I think of the war years, I think of Mr. Crosby also singing quite a lot of tunes with the Andrews Sisters. Can you comment on that beyond the singing? Were they traveling together during the war at all, or was it just a professional relationship?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that.
Can you repeat the last part?
Was it just a professional relationship, or did they actually spend time, for example, traveling abroad during the war years?
No. It was, You know, it's interesting, some of the greatest recordings in American music, beginning with the Hot Five, did not exist outside the studio. No, they made a lot of recordings. They had a lot of gold records together. They loved performing together, but no, they did not know each other socially. Maxine Andrews said that when they got to the studio, they would all be like, how will he be wearing his hat? If the hat was pulled low, it was going to be just business. Let's just get this done. If the brim was up on the back of his head, they would like, oh, we're going to have a great time today. It was all about the hat. And they all remembered the fact that Bing's foot was just, he beat the time through every number. They did a recording of Jingle Bells, wonderful record, very witty, beautifully arranged by Vic Shane. And then he said, let's do another take, which he didn't ever do unless they needed it. And in the middle of the take, he messes up a lyric, and he's like, jingle bells, holy Jesus Christ. The sisters are too frightened, like, to just laugh. They don't know what's going on, and they don't understand that when Bing does a breakdown take, you don't stop. You still have to go through the whole arrangement till the end. And by the end of it, everybody in the studio, this record exists, is cracked up. They're all laughing. And Maxine said, I think he did that to relax us. And she said, and it worked. After that, we were never intimidated by him.
Sir, would you like to go? In Richard Zoglin's recent biography of Bob Hope, he quotes Hope toward the end of his life as telling a colleague that he never liked Bing and he thought Bing was an SOB. I was wondering if you were aware of that and what your reaction is based on your own research.
I never saw that line. I'm not saying he never said it, but unlike the biographer you're talking about, I did interview Bob Hope, and it's certainly not how he described Bing to me. I think that's ridiculous. I mean, Dolores said to me, they were married for 65 years, and she said, I only saw him really, really cry once, and that was the day he learned that Bing had died. So does that sound like you thought that?
Wow.
I just want to thank you for both of your books. They're fantastic, and aren't they? And I know you've had so many people ask you this, how many books are left? Because there are quite a few years left till 1977, right? And I'm very aware, I'm in my 30s, and I'm sort of out, I do a Bing Crosby concert.
I'm in my 70s, man. I mean, I
know, the greatest. But people ask me, why do you like Bing Crosby so much? And I'm like, why don't you know that he sang more than Jingle Bells? You know, like he recorded 1,200 songs. And that's something I think your books have brought back, and you were saying maybe he's going to have a resurgence. I don't know why. Have people contacted you to do a movie or a musical of this? Like, we have Donna Summer on Broadway. Why not a Bing Crosby musical, you know? You know what I mean? Jersey Boys and everything else. It goes on and on.
Well, actually, somebody has spoken of doing a film. You know, we'll see. I just want to say something because you reminded me of it. One of the reasons I think Crosby isn't as well known as he should be has to do with this dreadful company. If anybody asks you, I didn't say this. Universal. Universal owns Decca, and they own everything that Paramount produced before 1950.
Wow.
When all the studios had to divest themselves of their theaters, and Paramount needed a fast cash infusion, they sold their entire library to Universal. Universal is the one company that doesn't really care about its archive. They care about Steven Spielberg movies, which is, fine, but they don't. So as a result, Turner Classic Movies doesn't have any of these movies. It has High Society, which they play all the time, and they can get White Christmas. But in order for them to show even Going My Way, they have to lease it. And so they'll show it once in a while, but that's why these movies aren't in rotation. Unfortunately, the same thing, it's even worse with the recordings. All the Decca recordings are also owned by Universal. And every time somebody puts out a Decca record, or a CD. It's, you know, White Christmas and Sweet Lilani and Swinging on It Starts, the same stuff over and over again. The man made more than 1,500 studio recordings, and there were some 2,000 other broadcast and radio recordings. And there's so much material. I mean, when the first book came out, I tried to convince, I went with an editor from Little Brown to Columbia, and I said, because Columbia and Sony and RCA had been now brought together under one roof. I said, I want to edit a collection of Crosby's jazz recordings. I had 4 CDs, 25 tracks on each, just of his jazz recordings. They called me into the office and they said, well, 4 is ridiculous. Could we do 2? Fine, I do 2. Could we do 1? I'm losing my interest, but I cut it down to 25. And then he said to me, this is a quote, Jeff. This you can quote. He said, I'd like to do it, but you know, there's still Miles Davis we haven't released. Really? Which Miles Davis? It can't be anything he actually did for release. It would have to be, you know, tapes that you've in the vault. Anyway, so that's the situation. That's one of the reasons I think that this music simply isn't available. On the other hand, I can say that if you're reading the book and there's a track I talk about and you're curious, it's almost invariably on YouTube. So that's a good thing to know.
Thank you.
Anyway, your question was about other volumes.
Yeah, you know.
Let me just say that it was only going to ever be 2 volumes, and then I said I want to do a book just about the war. So if there's going to be any more, it would be the 1 volume, and we'll see. No?
This was so interesting. I got so much depth out of Bing Crosby that I've never even thought about, and I've been following his career my whole life. And there would be so many things to bring up. I wanted to hear what you had to say, or what he had to say, or what anyone said about him doing blackface in Holiday Inn, because now it's like unwatchable, but we're certainly out of the context, and maybe they were then too.
Chapter 13 of this book, which I wish I could have sent to Megyn Kelly. It would have saved her career. Is entirely about blackface. Let me just say a couple of things. First of all, when he grew up, one of the performers he idolized was Al Jolson. And by that time, blackface really was a theatrical convention. And black performers were doing it not only as much as white performers, but more successfully. It was the ticket for a lot of them to get out of medicine shows and into more prestigious shows. The first great black performer on Broadway was Burt Williams, who performed in blackface. In the 1940s, when Crosby did it in 3 different films, there was a tremendous revival in blackface minstrelsy. I mean, we're fighting Japan and Germany, both of whom are claiming racial exceptionalism, and blackface minstrelsy has the biggest revival in the 20th century during the war. I give in one of the source notes 60 films that were made in those 4 years that have at least 1 blackface scene. People thought it was, the Life magazine thought it meant heritage and continuity. When Irving Berlin wrote Abraham, which almost every critic in the country thought was going to be the big hit from Holiday Inn, only one woman writing for the Herald Tribune said, before the end of the year, we're going to be hearing a lot of people singing White Christmas. The other reviewers, including Bosley Crowther and the Times, didn't mention what the big hit they thought was going to be Abraham, the swinging spiritual that Bing does in blackface with Louise Beavers. Berlin used the word darky in the song. It's in the film. He got a lot of angry mail from African-American newspapers. And he immediately apologized and had it taken out of all the sheet music. Unfortunately, it's in the film forever, but it's no longer part of the song. The film did not get a single complaint from African-American newspapers about the blackface. Why? Because so many black performers were still doing it. A few months later, Stormy Weather came out, an all-black film. And one of the scenes everybody remembers are these two legendary black comedians, Miller and Lyles, sitting backstage talking while putting the stuff on their
Great
face.
scene, too.
So
Very funny.
it certainly wasn't okay when Megyn Kelly was a child or when I was a child. But, you know, one of the lines I use, one of my historical mantras, is from the war writer Paul Fussell, who said, if you want to understand the past, you have to pretend that you don't know the present. And you have to put that into the context of that period.
And just one more thing. Bob Hope, since I remember all this when
Who
Bing,
also did blackface. Yeah, but go ahead.
but when Bing died, Bob Hope actually canceled he could not perform. He canceled his
Yes, right.
NBC
Yeah. He was
show
supposed to
that
perform
night.
in Washington.
Yeah,
and
so
he
that
canceled it.
biographer is my question.
Maybe this is jumping to the legendary or mythological third volume. You've talked a lot about Crosby, I think, at the peak of his powers and in the peak of his fame. So what happens after that? I mean, how does he handle the change after the war when he doesn't have that mission anymore?
Well, the biggest years in Crosby's life financially are from 1946 to 1949. Those are the four, if you include 45 with Bells of St. Mary's, those are the 5 years that he was at the very peak in the business. In 1946, of the 5 top grossing movies in the country, 3 of them were Crosby vehicles. He was the #1 at the box office, 47, 48, 49. This is very easy to understand when you remember that 3.2 million troops had just come back, and they really wanted to pay homage to Crosby. And it's one of the reasons that Sinatra, as William Manchester said, Frank Sinatra was probably the most hated man in the military, in the Army, the Navy, and the Coast Guard in that period, because he did nothing. I mean, he actually went after VJ Day, he went to Italy and complained about the lodgings. So this was partly why. But then 1950 hits and the whole country is changing. We're now in the nuclear era for sure. We're in rhythm and blues is about to turn into rock and roll. And the very qualities that made Crosby so indispensable in the 30s and 40s, his stoicism, his aloofness, his laid back, his cool, his imperturbable, I call it in the book, the virtue of the unflappable. Everything's going to turn out okay. Now suddenly seems old hat and grandfatherly and irrelevant, and so suddenly it's only the people of his generation who are still buying his records and watching his television specials, and he begins to he never retires, but he begins to disappear from, the dumbest thing ever in Crosby's career is the record producer who later became very successful producing pop records, who convinced Crosby to make a record called Hey Bing, Hey Jude. I don't even know, did they really think that Beatles fans were going to run out to get that? And did they think that Bing Crosby fans wanted to hear him sing Hey Jude? It's a ridiculous record. And in fact, the producer told me that while they were recording it, there were several takes, and he kept hearing this distortion in his headphones, and they were checking everything, and they couldn't figure it out. And then he looked at Crosby while they were doing it, and he had his hand in his pocket. And he had change in the pocket, and he said, Bing, is there something in your pocket? And he said, could you take the change out? And he put it out, and then there was no sound. And which tells you a little bit of how bored Crosby was for this session.
I know you touched upon HUAC a little while ago, and I have a question about whether Bing did anything in fighting the blacklist. And I say that because...
I'm sorry, I didn't...
I'm sorry, this is a question about the blacklist. and whether Bing did anything to fight the blacklist while he had some influence and some power, because there was an actor, Art Smith, who was in Just for You in 1952, and who was right after that blacklisted, and never worked again in a movie until The Hustler in 1960. And I wonder if Bing had input in hiring him before the blacklist.
Well, he did. Frank Tuttle, who was a known communist and was very proud of it, was Bing's favorite director in the 1930s. And he testified, and he thought he was going to outsmart the committee like a lot of people did and only name names that were named already. And so he said, well, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. Well, it turns out none of the Mrs. had been named. So he got 6 people in trouble who had not been before. And Bing hired him for his independent film at a time when he was pretty much banned. And he ended up going to Europe. But I mean, I can think of a couple of things like that, but I don't know. If he did, he always did those kinds of things and pretended he didn't know what the political ramifications were. I don't see him as a heroic figure in any way battling the blacklist. In fact, I can't think of anybody really who I would say that about until, the late 50s when it became safe, when Preminger and Kirk Douglas could start putting Dalton Trumbo's name on the screen.
Thank you.
Hello, Gary. My name is Martin McQuaid. I'm with Bing Crosby magazine, published by the International Club Crosby, and I can't tell you how thrilled the club is about this book. They're just over the moon with it. But before I ask the question, I just want to mention that when Paul McCartney was on the Howard Stern show, he did say, "Old Dad didn't do too bad by that recording of Hey Jude." So Paul McCartney might have liked it. But under the area of your book, I'm always intrigued by the Will Rogers project, and I always wondered how disappointed Bing may have been that it never really saw the light. And also, are any of the German phonetic recordings extant, Gary?
Yes. Yes, his singing "Going My," what Martin's referring to is while he was in Britain, he went to the APSI broadcasting studio, and they wanted him to say a few words that were going to be broadcast in Germany, and Bing didn't speak German, and so they wrote it out phonetically, and apparently it took him 15 minutes to figure it out, and he sang 2 songs in German. Which he didn't know a word of, and French, which he was fluent in, one in French. And so far, the only one that I know that's come up, that I've heard, is the German version of Going My Way, which is about under a minute long. What was the other?
The Will Rogers project.
The Will Rogers project. He was very close to a director named David Butler. They were very good friends. And Bing did 2 of his independent films with Butler. And Butler, when he had been at Fox, produced or directed most of Will Rogers' best-known movies, including Connecticut Yankee, which Crosby later remade. And when Rogers had died, it was a huge national mourning in a plane crash. And he wanted to make a biography of Will Rogers, and he was convinced that the only actor who could do it would be Crosby. So he arranged at Warner Brothers to do secret makeup tests where they used rubber and implants and stuff to change his looks. They wrote a scene, and they actually did a film test, which is on YouTube. It's quite amusing. And what happened was that some reporter, it was supposed to be done in the middle of the night, secret, nobody was supposed to know about this. Some reporter got wind of it, put it in a column, Paramount went nuts. They threatened to sue not Jack, but the brother who was really the money man at Warner, for making a secret test of our star. And David Butler called him up and said it was my fault and apologized, and the guy just cursed him out. Butler, 40 years later, is saying, "I never heard anything like that in my life." So there was never going to be a film because Warner Brothers owned the rights to Will Rogers and Paramount owned Bing Crosby. But do I think he regretted it? I think he was dying to make that film. He loved the idea that Butler was looking to him as a serious actor, and to play a character role like that. And when you look at the YouTube thing, you can see how much work he put into it.
Just one more question, if I might. Bing recorded Old Soldiers Never Die, I think right after the firing of General MacArthur. Was there any correspondence between General MacArthur and Bing leading
None
up to
I
that
ever
recording?
Saw. There was correspondence with Patton because he met Patton a few times during the tour, and he certainly had a relationship with Eisenhower, which I talk about in the book, but no, not MacArthur.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much.
Susan.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about the craft of biography, the art of biography.
Sorry?
I wanted to ask a question about the craft of biography,
yes,
the art
please.
of biography, since we were chatting before about writing too much and cutting back. It's hard to imagine, given how prolific you have been, writing even more than the book is in the book. But did you write more material that had to be cut back from the book for reasons of, coherence of the book or something? And how does that work? Can you give me advice?
I had a great editor who said to me, I will never ask you to cut just to cut, but I think that there are probably places where the book would be improved. And he brought in an outside editor who looked for cuttable things, and he clearly didn't understand the kind of book I was writing because he wanted me to cut like 100,000 words. But he basically wanted me to cut every person mentioned in the book that he had not heard of. So I didn't do that.
It's an organizing principle.
However, when he would mark in red like whole pages, I would look at them and think, well, this is long. I need this material, but I can cut these 2,000 words down to 300. I did a lot of that. There were some things I looked at that I thought they're amusing, but they really are impeding the narrative, so I stuck them in the source notes. But there was just other stuff that just didn't need to be there. So I did cut 42,000 words. And later, when it was in page proofs, the new editor came in and said, Gary, if there's anything you cut that you regret, put it back. Don't hesitate. And I have to say, there was nothing I wanted to put back. So.
My practice over the years has been to try to write 300 words a day, maybe 350, 400, when I'm in the writing stage.
Right.
And then at the end of the process, I have to start cutting 300 words a day.
That's, yeah. What about Jeff?
Oh, goodness. I'm writing a film about Hemingway now, and I'm inspired and terrified by his discipline. He wrote every morning of his life he'd get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and he wrote till noon, at which point he could have a drink, which was his goal. And his point was you should always stop when you know what the next part is. Mm-hmm. And when you still have juice,
Right.
he said. And the tragedy of his life, I'm obsessed with this because I'm writing a film for Ken on the subject. The terrible tragedy of him is that depression made it finally impossible for him to do that. And he'd get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and stand there and look at that piece of paper until noon. And he couldn't do it, and he finally killed himself. And I didn't mean to make it a downer, but that's discipline.
Yeah, yeah. We were talking not long ago about the Kilimanjaro stuff that he wrote in hundreds and hundreds of pages, and a lot of it is pretty stiff, and some of it's good. But just the fact that he turned out those words every day when he was in such pain.
Yeah. No, he's an inspiration. Yeah. And then he's very sad.
Right.
So the lesson is you have to write every day.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
If you're a biographer, that's...
Well, that's not quite true. I mean, I don't know if we want to do any of this, but I read a lot, and there comes a day when you say, I can't keep putting this stuff in, I have to put some of it down.
Right.
That's how I get started on all these projects. You sort of saturate your brain, then you go on reading, but
Right.
otherwise you'll never get going.
Graham Greene said he wrote 500 words every morning, and then it was straight to the brothel.
No, it's not bad.
All right. All right.
I have
One
a
more
question.
question.
More.
This is a question about going deep into the psychological profile of a subject. And I'm reading Mary Dearborn's book, because you mentioned Hemingway. In fact, you prompted this question, because I met her at the Leon Levy event last year. And she goes, I think she's the only woman to write a literary biography of Hemingway, because, of course, you know how hypermasculine he was. And I just wondered, for Crosby, how much did you go deep into the psychological? I didn't read your book, I'm sorry, not yet. So how deep did you go, and how would you go about doing that?
I don't go anywhere near that. I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't pretend to understand I don't think biography is speculating about what somebody thinks. I think you can put enough together of a profile by what they do, what they say, the letters they write, by how they spend the days of their lives. I let the reader, I try to give enough information that you can say, my God, I didn't realize Crosby was, that depressed or like that, or felt that way about drinking or whatever it is. But there are certain words that I really can't stand in biographies. One is hermeneutics, but another. But another is, when they start talking, using like dime stores psychological phrases that, if you don't have a license, really, leave it alone. The psychology, we can't really, the first thing a biographer, I won't say the first thing a biographer learns, because it's actually one of the later things, but one of the first things you have to accept is that there is, and Jeff spoke about this in the Leon Levy lecture, there are limits to what's knowable. And you have to accept that there are certain things that aren't knowable. There are certain doors that you're not welcome to go through. And I don't think that in any way impedes what we do as biographers. But I think to try to create a psychological portrait, unless you have a license, is almost always a mistake.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff, for pinching.